Welcome back, geography students. Hopefully the test treated you well this weekend. By the time you're watching this, I've probably at least looked at your essays and perhaps given you your final grade on that. Today we are talking about the New World. We talked about Europe, and we finished up with Europe with that test. Now we're moving on to the New World, and we're really dividing the New World into two sections. We're going to talk about South America, Mexico, Canada, kind of together as one big unit, and then we're going to talk about the United States. And it's kind of biased, it's kind of silly. There's a lot more geography and culture going on in the New World than just the United States. But you live in the United States. You're probably going to interact more with the geography and the culture of the United States than any other nation, unless you are an avid world traveler or perhaps are going to live abroad. So we'll spend most of our time talking about the United States. Not today, though. Today we are going to talk about the history of the New World, the history of the Spanish colonization and the Portuguese colonization of the New World, actually, which really covers everything from Mexico south and even some parts of the United States, although we will save the discussion of the parts of the United States influenced by Spanish culture for another day. Originally, I was going to make this lecture into two parts, but for technical issues that you don't need to burden yourself with, I've decided to just make this one long lecture. So there's only one lecture this week. It's this one. You might consider taking a break in the middle of it. You don't have to watch it all in one sitting. There's a especially good place to take a break between Mexico and our discussion of South America, the Incas. So if you need a break, if you want to come back to it on day 2, feel free to do that. That's fine. But anyway, technical glitches are fun. This is why distance learning is awesome, right? No, just kidding. I would rather see your beautiful smiling faces, or maybe your asleep faces, depending on the day. So let's talk about the history of the New World. Now, when we talk about the history of the New World, we must acknowledge the elephant in the room, that the people of the New World didn't come into existence in 1492. The history of the New World doesn't start in 1492, but from our geographical perspective today, from an overview perspective, we are going to start in 1492. Now, I want you to keep a couple things in mind with that starting date. In 1492, most historians believe that there were upwards of 100 million people in the New World. These would be the Native Americans, all the way from the tip of Alaska down to the Tierra del Fuego in Argentina and Chile. There were 100 million people. And there were several incredibly advanced societies, sophisticated societies. The Aztecs and the Inca are the most famous of those societies. And these were societies that were not only, shaping their environment through building, but they were sometimes changing entire environments. And they're interesting, they're worth talking about. We may even, when we're back together in class, spend some time digging into some of them. The problem, the difficulty, is that almost everything we know about pre-1492 America comes from archaeology. And there's a big problem with archaeology, and that's that it has to be interpreted. And, to be perfectly clear, almost all data, almost all written words have to be interpreted. Right? You've gotten a text from a friend that you took totally the wrong way before, and the same thing can be true of ancient writers. The same thing can be true of an archaeological find. The problem is, without written documents, it becomes much more difficult to know for sure what we're finding, what we're looking at. And the problem pre-1492 is that the Native American civilizations, despite the fact that several of them were very sophisticated, as a whole did not develop writing. In fact, the Mayans developed a system of writing, and even then, the Mayans primarily used their writing system for religious purposes, which is fascinating. Tells us a lot about Mayan religions and Mayan calendars. You might be familiar with the fact that many people believe the Mayans predicted the end of the world in 2012. Spoiler alert, they didn't. That's just where they ended their calendar. And considering the Mayans were at their height in writing calendars between 800 and 1000 AD, I think a calendar that goes 1,000 years into the future is probably good. And I'm sure the Maya were like, yeah, I'm just not going to make another calendar. In a couple hundred years, I'll make the next one. Of course, the Maya weren't around in a couple hundred years, so they didn't make another calendar. But even then, the writing that the Mayans did was not historical. They didn't tell us that so-and-so was king of so-and-so and killed so-and-so. We don't have that kind of information from the New World. And because of that, we are mostly reliant on archaeology, which again is very limited. It's hard to know what's happening when all you have is bones and pottery fragments. Or we're reliant on the traditions that are either passed down today orally, spoken. Your grandmother tells you a story, you tell a story to your grandkids, or written down by the Spanish in the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, the years after they arrived in the New World. So it is very difficult to be sure what was going on before 1492. Before the Spanish show up, it's very hard to know what was going on. So we're going to start in 1492. That's not to say that the Native Americans weren't doing impressive things. That's not to say that what they were doing wasn't important. It is, but we have to start somewhere for this discussion of geography and culture, because really what we're talking about today is the development of cultures. Because if you look at the New World, you will quickly notice that the United States and Canada have a very different feel. They have a different culture from the rest of the New World. And today we're going to talk about one of the big reasons for that. And one of the big reasons is the Spanish and how the Spanish chose to colonize the New World versus how perhaps the English and the French did. And in addition to that, that's one factor. Factor two is the size of the native populations and the importation of slaves. These are really the three pillars that determine the cultures and the identities of New World nations. How robust was the native population? Did they survive the diseases that the Europeans brought? Did they survive the enslavement that unfortunately often came with the Europeans? How much was the slave economy required to make it profitable for the Europeans? How many slaves were imported? And how many Europeans showed up? And what were they like? Were they single men? Were they families? That has a lot to do with the cultures that develop in the New World. And we're going to talk about several different nations and several different regions and how they developed very differently because of different combinations of these factors. So it's important to keep in mind what we're doing here. We're talking about cultures. How did the unique cultures of the Americas develop? So let's start in 1492. Of course, you know what happened in 1492. You're familiar with the elementary school rhyme. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. It's important to point out that Columbus was actually sailing west not because he thought that there was undiscovered land, but because he thought he could get to Asia. All the way back in Roman and Greek times, we have two geographers named Strabo and Eratosthenes that had done a series of trigonometric equations, and they had determined that the Earth was approximately 25,000 miles in circumference. And in fact, with the modern benefit of satellites and better math, we know that they were actually surprisingly accurate. They weren't exactly right, but they were close. It is approximately 25,000 miles around the Earth, along the equator. Columbus, though, had done the math, and he had come up with a significantly smaller number. In fact, I think he came up with around 14,000 square miles. And effectively, to get a globe that small, he decided that clearly Asia and Europe must actually be very close together. In fact, only a few thousand miles could separate them if there was only 14,000 miles in circumference, if the Earth was only 14,000 miles in circumference. So he planned or requested the funding for an expedition to sail west from Europe, and he was convinced that he would hit either Japan or India very quickly by doing so. Now, in 1492, several people were available to finance these kind of expeditions. There were the Portuguese, but the Portuguese were busy exploring Africa. And in fact, they had just recently discovered a way around the southern tip of Africa, which perhaps put India and Asia within their grasp in a way that they already knew how to go. So the Portuguese were not interested in what Columbus was selling. The Spanish, on the other hand, were. And the Spanish were interested because in 1492 they had finally completed the reconquista, the reconquest of Spain from the Muslims. And because of this, the Spanish monarchs now had significantly more manpower and resources that they weren't using to fight, and they looked at their Portuguese neighbors and they said, uh-oh, we are behind. Because the Portuguese, because they had less territory to reconquer, had driven out the Muslims much earlier, and because of this, they had been able to spend their money and their resources developing their economics. Wow, cannot speak today. Economics, their economy. Okay, that's probably what I was going for. And the Portuguese had developed this network of trading posts down the African coast, and they were bringing in huge amounts of wealth. And the Spanish said, wow, we need something like that. Okay, not Africa. Portugal's already there. We're going to get to Asia another way. And so they decide to bite on this whole Christopher Columbus thing. I'm not particularly convinced that Isabella and Ferdinand believed Columbus. In fact, several people have written from the court documents that Isabella was fairly convinced that Christopher Columbus had got the path wrong. She was right. He had. In fact, Columbus got lucky, right? I mean, that's the reality. If Columbus had sailed west and North America or the New World didn't exist, if the land just wasn't there, he would have starved to death and died and never returned. He would have vanished over the horizon. We wouldn't know who he was. He would have been totally wrong. But he gets lucky, and there actually is land. So in 1492, the Spanish, through Christopher Columbus, discover that there is, in fact, a new world. Now, of course, the information that there was a new world was technically out there. Leif Erikson had discovered the New World back around 1000 AD, and there had even been a saga, an Icelandic tale describing his discoveries that was known in Iceland, certainly, and perhaps in Scandinavia. But the problem for the Vikings is they couldn't exploit the discovery. The technology that the Vikings possessed was impressive. The fact that they could sail all the way from Europe to Greenland was impressive, with a couple stops along the way. But they really could not continue to go farther. The population of Iceland and Greenland was too low to support colonization of another island, Newfoundland, or Vinland, as the Vikings called it. The support from Scandinavia was not forthcoming. The technology required was large, and the Vikings were scared off by the incredibly brutal Canadian winters, which sounds funny for people that were literally living in Greenland and Iceland at the time. But remember that the Gulf Stream, by bringing warm water from the Caribbean up towards Europe and then around towards Iceland, actually made the climate in Iceland and even in Greenland at that time much more bearable, and certainly nicer than Newfoundland and Labrador. So the Vikings, this was an even less hospitable area. So the Vikings never colonized the New World. And so in 1492, the Spanish arrived. And the Spanish, as opposed to the Vikings, did have the resources and had the will to use their resources to colonize the New World. And of course, that's what they do. The Spanish come for two reasons. Reason number one is they thought that there was gold everywhere. According to Columbus, and Columbus kidnapped natives and brought them back with him, according to the natives and according to Columbus, there was gold everywhere. And the evidence of this to Columbus was the fact that the natives had all sorts of gold jewelry. They wore huge amounts of gold, gold at levels that even the European kings didn't wear. And so that must mean that gold is incredibly plentiful. And the reality is that that's not the case. Gold is not plentiful in the New World. It just happened to be that over years and years of trade that this jewelry had kind of ended up in circulation. Nobody used gold. Gold was not a particularly valuable material to the New World civilizations. And so, yes, it was used as a decorative material, but there wasn't a whole bunch of it laying around anywhere. The Inca had a lot of it, and that eventually got sent back to Spain. But it wasn't laying everywhere. I mean, the Spanish literally came to the New World expecting to pick it up right off the beach, right off the ground. They thought it was going to be everywhere, and that simply was not the case. The other reason that the Spanish began to heavily invest in the New World is because the Pope basically said, if you want to take over all that territory, that's fine, but you need to bring Christianity with you. And so the Spanish bring missionaries, they bring priests over to attempt to convert the native population. And on one hand, as Christians, I think to some extent we can kind of cheer that on and go, well, I'm glad that the Pope and the Spanish cared about the eternal souls of the Native Americans. Unfortunately, the Spanish just mess it up. And maybe we can give them a pass because really missions didn't exist. You're either Christian or you weren't Christian, and there wasn't a lot of evangelism going on. But the Spanish show up, and they hand Bibles to the natives. And remember that the natives don't have their own written languages, and so they don't know what a written language is. So you hand them a piece of, multi-piece of paper with little black squiggles on it that they don't understand. Undoubtedly, the natives kind of didn't know what to do with it. Maybe they held it, with one finger up. Maybe they dropped it. Maybe they threw it in the fire. They didn't know what it was. And the Spanish, anytime they mistreated the Bible, took this as a horrendous offense and often killed those natives that they were trying to reach immediately. So unfortunately, while the Spanish come over to be missionaries, they're not very good missionaries. And part of that's because no one had ever done it before, but part of it's because the Spanish were just particularly bloodthirsty about these things. The Spanish began colonizing the Caribbean, those initial islands that Columbus had discovered. And very quickly, it becomes apparent that there is not gold laying all over the place. Okay, you can't just walk through the jungle, pick up some chunks of gold, and retire to Spain as a wealthy man. Not an option. And very quickly, after about 15, 20 years, the Spanish begin to go, why are we here? Right? It is nasty here. Because I know, as an American, you think the Caribbean, you think like the Bahamas, the beach, the sunbathing, right? It's got to be nice all the time. The reality, 500 years ago, the Caribbean was not nice. It was full of jungle. It was full of every biting insect that you could name. And it had diseases. Oh, the diseases that it had. And most of the diseases, unfortunately, were brought by the Europeans. But they got into the jungles and into the bugs in the jungles. And the bugs in the jungles carry the bugs that infect the humans. And it was quickly apparent that you did not want to live there. Unless there was good reason to live there, which gold lying around in the middle of the jungle would have been pretty good, but it didn't exist. And so the Spanish were like, why are we here? What are we going to do with this land that we've taken over? Doesn't seem valuable. And the Spanish began to look around to think about how can we make this land valuable. And unfortunately, they found a way to do that. And they found it with their good buddies, the Portuguese. The Portuguese, you see, in the 1450s, had come into the possession of a number of islands off the coast of Africa. And these islands were very similar to the Caribbean islands. They were tropical. And the Portuguese realized very quickly that they could grow something there. And that product was sugarcane. Now, sugarcane was grown really only in the Muslim world. The Muslims provided all of the sugar available in Europe, with the exception of, I think, Malta. I think it was possible to grow sugarcane on the island of Malta. And the Knights Hospitier, I think, grew some. But really, sugar was a very limited commodity in Europe in the 1400s. And the Portuguese quickly realized in the 1450s that these islands off the coast of Africa were ideal sugar islands. The problem is that working on a sugar plantation is miserable, and it's actually very dangerous. At least it's dangerous if you're going to produce large quantities of sugarcane. And the Portuguese are also now trading with the empires of Africa, and the empires of Africa want a number of products: guns, horses, alcohol. And their primary trade product that they had to give the Portuguese are slaves, because it was very common in African culture to capture your enemies and sell them as slaves. And this is, by the way, is common in all human cultures. Slavery is very common. The winners of wars take the losers and sell them as slaves. But throughout most of human history, this was not quite as bad of a practice as the African slave trade will quickly become. Because typically, when you are captured as a slave, you are sold to someone who is very similar to you. And there is usually a clear process in which you as a slave can become a citizen of the nation or the group that you have joined. And certainly in East Africa, this would have been very common. Yes, you might be captured as a slave, but your skin color is the same as the people that bought you. Your language is probably similar, and so you might spend a few years as a slave and then be freed, or a few years and you might escape, or a few years and you might get married off to somebody and become free that way. The problem is when the African nations began selling their slaves to the Portuguese would take them to the sugar islands, and things were not so good there. Because number one, the death rate on sugar islands was immense. Somewhere between 50 and 90%, depending on the island or the area. 50 to 90%. So even on the best of sugar islands, the first-year arrivals had a 1 in 2 chance of dying, and that's on the best islands. If you're on a bad island, 9 out of 10 first-year arrivals would die. If you survived the first year, you were probably good. But the first year was brutal. So number one, your chance of dying, very high. Pretty much better than 50%. Greater than 50% chance that you were going to die in the first year. In addition to that, the people that owned you no longer shared a language with you, no longer shared a skin color with you, no longer shared a culture with you. So it was much more likely for the slaves that had been captured to stay as slaves and to stay as almost a second class of citizens. And this eventually grows into the slave economy, the slave culture, where the African American slaves are second-class citizens. And again, historical slavery didn't work like this. Typically, your race, your looks had nothing to do with your slave status. right? Just because someone was black in the Roman Empire wouldn't have made them a slave. If they'd been captured by a victorious winner, they might be a slave, but they could have been the descendant of a slave and now been a free person, and no one would assume by the color of their skin that they were a slave. That changes in the New World. So the Portuguese began using slaves to cultivate their sugarcane. So back to the Spanish, right? In approximately in the 15 teens, 1520s, the Spanish are miserable in their Caribbean islands, and they come upon the idea of growing sugar there. And the Caribbean turns out to be probably the best place in the world for sugarcane. And at first, the Spanish used the native population. The problem is the native population was not robust enough to survive slavery for two reasons. Number one, Native American populations were incredibly vulnerable to European diseases. They had lived spread out. They were not accustomed to dealing with disease. They didn't have diseases the way the Europeans and the Africans did. And so the native population of the New World was massively decreased by disease. But in addition to that, as I've told you, working on a sugar plantation was a brutal experience. Again, 9 out of 10 first-year workers would die on bad plantations. Again, the best it could get is 1 out of 2. So between the diseases and between the nasty working conditions, a vast majority of the Native Americans died in the Caribbean. And eventually the Spanish were forced to turn to the Portuguese model and begin bringing in African Americans. And so in the Caribbean, you have two distinct cultures that develop. You have a slave culture, which is most visible today in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and you have a Spanish culture, which has a little bit less slavery, although certainly there is still African culture and African DNA involved, even in places like Cuba and Puerto Rico, places that had less African Americans, or Africans, excuse me. African Americans live in the United States. Although I suppose you could say that if you are of African descent and live in the Americas, you are an African American. But typically, when we use African American, we're talking about United States, blacks that live in the United States. So, what happens in the Caribbean is we have almost exclusively European and African cultures. Sometimes they're African and European cultures combined, notably on the island of Haiti, which is a fascinating place. Okay, we think of it, unfortunately, today as mostly poor, affected by earthquakes. But Haiti was actually the second nation in the New World to throw off European dominance. The former slaves of Haiti actually defeated an army sent by Napoleon and established their own republic. Unfortunately, racial ideas of the time led the Haitians to be ostracized by the Spanish nations and the United States. But that is a sad story, unfortunately, for another time. Now, the Spanish moved on from the Caribbean, and of course, they landed in Mexico. And the story of Mexico is also a sad experience for the natives. And of course, you are familiar with the man that will eventually destroy the native empires, and that is Hernan Cortez. Now, Hernan Cortez was driven out of Spain, and then he was driven out of Cuba, and eventually he lands on the mainland of Mexico, not knowing a lot about it. And he kind of burns and fights his way across with a small band of men, approximately 300 men, and he destroys a city and then rebuilds it, and he names it Veracruz. And in Veracruz, he begins to hear of this massive empire in the interior of Mexico, and he sets his sight on taking over that empire. And the reason he does this is he forms alliances with small cities and city-states around him. He defeats them in battle, and then they kind of join him, and they say, Cortez, you're so powerful, why don't you take down the Aztecs? They're kind of the top dog around here. If you take down the top dog, you'll become the top dog. Right? And I think there was some manipulation going on here. I think these Native Americans were not dumb. They realized that the Spanish were good warriors, but there wasn't a lot of them. Perhaps they hoped that the Aztecs and the Spanish would kill each other and they could take over. So I don't think this is just the Native Americans not thinking ahead about what will happen. I think they were hoping that the Spanish would attack the Aztecs and fail, or attack the Aztecs and be so weak that they could be destroyed. Cortez also captured a young woman and, in fact, effectively made her his mistress and married her, even though he had a wife back in Spain, that spoke the local dialects, spoke Aztec or Mexica. And between having a native interpreter and having all of these native allies, Cortez decided that he was going to attack the Aztecs. And he actually marches his army to the capital of the Aztecs, Tenochtitlan, which is this beautiful floating city. It's actually on a number of islands, and then there's bridges and floating platforms that connect these islands together out on a lake. And Cortez arrives at the city, and the Aztecs really aren't sure what to do with him. They know he's a warrior. Fame of his conquests has spread to them. But, Cortez has a few hundred soldiers. The Aztecs can control hundreds of thousands of soldiers, so they don't really consider Cortez a threat. Instead, they invite him into the city to kind of figure out who he is. They have some interpreters who have interacted with the Spanish. Cortez has his mistress who can speak to the Mexica, which is, of course, what the Aztecs called themselves. And so they negotiate for a while, and then Cortez kidnaps the Aztec emperor. And he holds the emperor, and he effectively ransoms the emperor back to the Aztecs. He said, give me gold, give me wealth for your emperor, and I will leave. So the Aztecs go, okay. They kind of get wealth together, but they kind of drag their feet, and Cortez gets nervous, and he kills the emperor, and the Aztecs say, you shouldn't have done that. We're going to punish you for this, and they attempt to kill the Spanish. And the Spanish have to kind of cut their way out of the city. They escape, and the Aztecs kind of wipe their hands off and say good riddance. Unfortunately for the Aztecs still really don't know what to do with Cortez. They get together and they talk for a while. What are we going to do about these guys? Should we attack? In the meantime, Cortez gets back to Veracruz. A Spanish army has just gotten off their boats, and they say, Cortez, we are here to arrest you. You're going back to Cuba. And Cortez says, I've got a better idea. Why don't instead you join me, or we're going to go take the Aztecs out, and we are going to make ourselves the rulers of this land. And the army says, oh, that sounds like a good plan. And so they follow Cortez. Cortez builds a number of ships on the lake that Tenochtitlan was on, and he attacks the city. In a month-long battle, the Spanish troops take the capital and destroy the Aztec ruling families. And so the head of the snake is chopped off. And the Spanish take Tenochtitlan, and they demand that all of the subjects of the Aztecs continue to bring them tribute. So effectively, how the Aztec Empire worked is that the Mexica, the leaders, were these great warriors, and they defeated all of the neighboring tribes, and they demanded that those tribes bring them resources every year. It's like taxes. Bring us your stuff. And if you don't bring us your stuff, we'll come kill you, we'll sacrifice you, we'll tear your hearts out, that fun stuff that the Aztecs did. And so the Spanish effectively replace the Aztecs at the top of the food chain. They say, hey, nice to meet you. We're the Spanish. You're under new management. And we expect you to bring the same stuff to us that you would have brought to the Aztecs. And if you don't bring it, we'll come and we'll take you out. And so effectively, in just a matter of years, the Spanish go from a few hundred soldiers on the coast to controlling the entire Aztec Empire. And of course, for most people in the Aztec Empire, nothing changed. The guys at the top had changed, but the threats hadn't, right? If you didn't pay the Aztecs, they'd kill you. If you didn't pay the Spanish, they'd kill you. What changed? Very little. The Spanish do begin, though, to take a firmer control of the area. They send missionaries out to evangelize. They send governors and political officers out to take control of different segments of the Mexican territory. And by 1600, just 100 years later, the Spanish are in complete control of the area. Now, all that being said, let's talk about the culture that's going to develop in Mexico and in Central America in general. The Spanish arrive, and the Spanish colonization of the New World is very different from what the English and even the French do in North America or upper North America. The average Spanish colonist, or if we can even call them that, the average Spanish conquistador, was typically married, but he left his wife and his children at home in Spain. And the difficulty of the crossing and the length of the crossing meant that most Spanish explorers, most Spanish colonizers, were going to be in the New World for a long period of time, sometimes as many as 10 or 20 years. And because of this, they would often take native women as their mistresses. And this sounds kind of dirty and bad, but it explains the cultural development of these areas. And so effectively what these Spanish men would do is they would start a second family. So they'd have a family back home, but they would have a new native family in the New World. And what happens very quickly is that the Spanish and the natives quickly blend together. And the people that result are not Spanish, they're not Mexica, but they're new. They're new people, right? They're, as humans do, when they're in close proximity to each other, they mesh together. And we're not just talking about biological blending, we're talking about cultural blending, right? And for example, let me give you an example of this that you might be familiar with. If you have seen the Pixar movie Coco, you actually have seen a direct cultural result of this blending of the Mexica and the Spanish. The Mexica have these ancient Aztec rituals that often involve death, skull-like imagery, and of course the Spanish are Catholic. And by combining these cultures, you actually get a religious festival called the Day of the Dead, or the Day de la Muerta, and it features skeletons walking again on certain days, and this entire religious festival is actually a combination of Catholicism and Aztec religion. And so, you've got this De la Muerta event and this imagery specific to the Spanish in the New World. Now, that's not to say that De la Muerta doesn't exist elsewhere in the world, right? It is a Catholic festival, but the specific imagery that you're most familiar with, if you've seen the movie Coco, is actually Aztec imagery. So we have this blending of culture, and unfortunately, the Spanish actually kept really tight control, or maybe I should say, kept close track of what level of blending you were. They had like a 16ths scale. So you might be 3/16 Mexica and 13/16 Spanish. And because you had that specific level of genetics, you could hold certain jobs and couldn't hold other jobs. You could run for office or you couldn't run for office. You could live in this part of the city but not this part of the city. So the Spanish tracked all of this, which I think you can agree that that's completely silly, right? There's still some racial prejudice there, even though in reality there's no difference from a racial perspective. I mean, skin color, that's about it. But this was tightly controlled by the Spanish, tightly monitored, I should say. So we have a blended culture, very blended culture. This is why Mexico is very different from Spain, right? If you look at pictures of Spain and pictures of Mexico, the people don't look the same. They don't act the same. They don't have the same culture. They might speak the same language, but even then, the Spanish and the Mexicans actually speak different dialects. In fact, depending on who you talk to, the Mexicans will claim that they have correct Spanish, and the Spanish will claim that they have correct Spanish. The Mexicans claim that the Spaniards actually have an accent, a lisp, because one of the Spanish kings had a lisp in the 1700s, and supposedly all of the Spanish picked it up, and the Mexicans have the right Spanish. I don't know. I'll let actual Spanish speakers fight that one out, but I've heard that. That's kind of something that's going on. So far, we've actually seen two entirely different cultural areas. We have the Caribbean, which is a combination of European and Africans. We've got the Mexico, Central America Spanish areas, which are a combination of the Spanish and the natives, and really no African influence. Very few black slaves are imported into that area. And now moving on to South America, we're going to have entirely different combinations of people. And again, everywhere you go in Spanish America, you have people combining in interesting ways. And this is very different from English North America. Because in English North America, we have these huge migrations of people, oftentimes families, men and women coming over together, having umpteen bazillion kids. And so you have very homogenized European populations in the United States and in Canada. That's very common. In Spanish America and Portuguese America, you have very mixed cultures. You have the natives and the Europeans and the Africans. They're all intermixing and marrying and having babies and doing things that humans do. And the resulting cultures are very different and unique and awesome, right? I mean, all of this diversity is a good thing, but that's how it's going on. So now we need to move down to South America. And again, if you want to take a break, if you're getting tired of this lecture, you need a brain break, go take a brain break, come back to this tomorrow. But we're going to move on to South America. South America has two massive geographical features that we have to talk about, even now. Even though we'll talk about these in detail later on in this course, we have to talk about them now, and that is the Amazon River Basin and the Andes Mountains. Let's start with the Amazon River Basin. So the Amazon is the largest river in the world. It's got a huge volume. The Amazon rainforest, the rainforest that surrounds the river, is the largest in the world. And you might think that the largest river in the world must have supported a huge population, and you would be wrong. Right? The Amazon and the Amazon jungle is a very, very foreboding place. It is not an easy place to live. Not an easy place. Even today, at the technology level of the modern world, it is hard to live in the Amazon. There's disease. Everything wants to kill you. Have you ever seen fish from the Amazon? If you think piranhas are the only ones that you don't want to tangle with, I encourage you, just look up on Google. Just Google Amazon river fish. Or look up river monsters and watch some of his episodes on the Amazon. It's like teeth coming out of every angle, right? I mean, everything in that river wants to kill you. Everything in the jungle wants to kill you. So the Amazon really divides South America. The culture north of the river and the culture south of the river are completely different today. Completely different. And then the Andes Mountains are also another dividing line, because the Andes Mountains are incredibly tall, really the second tallest set of mountains in the world, behind only the Himalayas. And as a result of their height, they create radically different climate zones. There's the incredibly wet eastern side, like the Amazon basin, very wet rainforest. Then we have the incredibly dry western side, deserts, salt flats. And then we have a third climate zone in the mountain itself, in the mountains themselves, which are very fertile and actually can support large populations, which is surprising because typically mountains are not where we would look for populations. But in South America, a lot more people lived in the mountains than lived down in the Amazon basin or in the deserts. Right? A lot more people lived in the mountains. That's very interesting. So we've got 3 zones. So if you pull up a map of South America, if you picture a map in your mind, I want you to kind of divide it in 3. So we've got a north-south line that follows the Andes Mountains. Okay? And then we have an east-west line that kind of follows the Amazon River. And this divides South America into 3 quadrants. We've got the northeast quadrant, which is along the southern boundary of the Caribbean. We've got the western boundary, which is all down the backbone of South America. And finally, we have the southeastern quadrant, which is the southern part of Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay. That's the southern quadrant, or the southern section. So we've got South America divided in 3. And let's talk about all 3 sections. Let's start with the northeast section. And that's the section of South America that kind of borders the Caribbean. Very early on, the Spanish arrive here, just like they did in the Caribbean. And very quickly, they also realize that there is not gold laying all over the jungle floor just to be picked up. So much like the rest of the Caribbean, they quickly have to ask themselves, what are we going to do here? Why are we here? How are we going to get rich? And they quickly settle on the idea of growing sugar there as well. Now, unfortunately, sugar doesn't grow quite as well in that section as it does in the Caribbean. It does grow, but it doesn't grow quite as well. And in addition to this, there is almost no native population. There's native tribes that live way out in the jungle, but they can't be captured. They're very crafty. And so almost immediately, the Spanish began bringing massive numbers of Africans in as slaves. This is occurring from northern Brazil all the way up to Venezuela. Massive numbers of Africans are being brought in. Now, these Africans, coming in a little bit later, have a unique situation, because one of the problems for the Africans on those Caribbean islands is that your friends, the people that you can associate with, are very limited, right? Imagine that you're on an island that's 10 miles by 10 miles, right? There might be 1,000 slaves on the island, but remember that slaves are being taken from all over Africa. Most of the people on the island don't speak your language. Most of the people on the island are different than you, right? They're a different nation, they're a different culture than you. And this means that the Caribbean islands, most of them don't develop sophisticated African cultures. They develop new cultures, certainly, but they don't develop old school African cultures. That's very different in the northern part of South America. When the Africans are taken over, many of them quickly think to themselves, I don't want to die on this sugar plantation. And unlike the islands, this is another difference, you can actually run away. Because think about it, if you're on an island, how far can you run? Are you going to jump in the water and swim? No, you really can't. There's nowhere to go. So you're stuck. And even if you run away and you hide, you're going to be found. On the other hand, if you run into the Amazon jungle and don't die, you're never going to be found, right? The Spanish can chase you, the Portuguese can chase you, but they can't find you. As soon as you vanish into the Amazon, you're gone. And what would happen is these Africans would escape. They would meet up, or they would meet up with the natives. And what happened in the 15 and 1600s is that these escaped Africans actually built societies. And the interesting thing is the societies that they build are actually really African societies. So by the 1600s, you have this incredible environment where you have African nations in northern South America, right? I mean, that's wild to think about. But these are escaped slaves that had gathered together, and they're now deep in the jungle, hiding from the Spanish or resisting, fighting the Spanish sometimes to keep their independence. And they're developing their own unique culture. So fascinating. By the way, another reason that this happened is because oftentimes with the East African or the West African practice of slavery, you would capture the leaders of the enemy. And by selling him to the Portuguese or the Spanish, you got rid of him or her. Right? If you can sell the enemy's leaders and ship them over the ocean, they're never coming back. It's like killing them without having to actually strike the blow. But when these people arrived in the New World and they escaped, they quickly found themselves in communities that actually spoke their language, that shared culture with them, and oftentimes you might find that the leader of your tribe just showed up in your camp. And so you also almost have African kingdoms being established in Northern South America. Unfortunately, these kingdoms are eventually reconquered by the Spanish, but eventually what happens is you actually have in Northern South America a unique experience, and that some of the nations that come out are Spanish, but some of the nations that come to exist are really more African in background. This would include Suriname, Guyana. These are nations that have a primarily African and native background. So you have a completely different culture here in Northern South America that is primarily African-inspired. Fascinating. Now, moving to another section of South America, we have the western section. This is the section of the Andes and west, and this is the area dominated by the empire that we call the Inca. Now, the people of the Andes Mountains have a very interesting situation because the Andes Mountains are so tall, and the climate of South America is interesting. Almost all the water falls either in the Amazon or it falls in the mountains, and almost none of it falls on the western coast of South America. This leads to the western coast of South America being deserts, salt flats, really dry, not a place that you would want to live. This drives the populations that move down from North America as they're migrating into South America. This drives those populations up into the mountains. And so uniquely in world history, you have a sophisticated, large group of people living in mountains where they have water. They don't live on the flat land. There's no water down there. And in fact, the people of the mountains begin to bury their dead down in the deserts, which is actually fascinating. It creates natural mummies. If you've never seen them, look up some mummies from South America. You'll see some of these natural mummifications. It's not like the Egyptians who intentionally mummified. These are natural mummifications. They're in such dry, hot environments that the bodies mummify. Really fascinating and interesting from an archaeological point of view. But these people in the mountains, they have a unique opportunity. They have a unique agricultural product that they have access to that is going to lead them to create massive populations. And that product is a very humble one that you're probably familiar with, may have even eaten within the last few days. That is the potato. The Inca, the people that will become the Inca, discover the potato. And the discovery of the potato is one of those crazy human stories. Like how the Native Americans figured out that potatoes could be eaten, I have no idea. I honestly can't tell you. Because the potato originally was poisonous. And in fact, to successfully digest the potato, because if you didn't do this, you'd throw up, because it's not poisonous as like it'll kill you, but it will make you upchuck. That's the kind of poison we're talking about. In order to eat a potato, you needed to eat the potato with dirt. If you ate it with dirt, specifically a type of clay found in the mountains, the poison would actually bind with the clay. It's like a chemical reaction, and it would then pass through your system. Right? You can expel the poison and the clay in your droppings, and you can eat the potatoes. Now, why the Native Americans decided to eat this plant, I have no idea. Could not tell you. But that's how it started. Now, the Native Americans took this plant and they began breeding it and cultivating it, and very quickly they managed to breed the poison out of the plant. And so now you don't have to eat dirt with your potatoes. You can just eat the potatoes. And from there, the Native Americans just go wild, right? They produce bigger and bigger and bigger potatoes. And the potato, can I just tell you, is one of the most impressive and most useful plants on the planet Earth. And it's really got three things going for it. Number one, the potato can take care of all of your needs nutritionally by itself. And scientists have done this experiment. You can eat nothing but potatoes for a year and you will be perfectly healthy. It has every nutrient you need. You need to eat nothing but potatoes. Now, that might be boring. You might be sick of potatoes by the end of a year, but you can eat nothing but potatoes and be healthy. Number 2, potatoes have an incredible yield per square foot. What do I mean by that? So if you plant a field of corn, you will get a certain number of pounds of corn. Potatoes are the most efficient plant by square foot on earth. If you plant a field of potatoes, you will get 5 to 10 times as many pounds of food as you would if you planted a field of wheat or corn. Advantage 3. Potatoes will grow anywhere. So not only do you get more food per square foot of potato, if you want to plant potatoes, you can plant them anywhere. You can plant them in a couple inches of dirt. If you can bury the tuber, the brown part of the potato or the red part of the potato, depending on which potato you're using, if you can bury the potato, it will grow. Potatoes will grow anywhere. Right? You put dirt on the top of your house, you can grow a potato. You put dirt on the side of the mountain, you can grow a potato. You put dirt on top of sidewalk, you can grow a potato, right? Potatoes just grow. Anywhere there's dirt, they will grow, right? So they're super easy to grow. And actually, there's a fourth thing. While I'm at it, let's just throw this on there. Potatoes don't go bad very quickly. In fact, you can do this experiment. Have your parents buy a potato, put a potato by itself in a dark drawer, and you come back a few weeks later, it hasn't rotted. It's actually stuck all these little gross tumor stems off of it, right? Trying to grow. Potatoes are like the things that won't die. And you cut those little stems off, you can eat the potato. Right? I mean, check it. It can rot. Don't get me wrong. Potatoes aren't immune to rotting, but it takes them a long time. So they're nutritious. They grow anywhere. You can get a lot of them. They don't rot. They're pretty much nature's wonder food. Probably one of the best plants on the entire planet. Certainly useful for human cultivation. And because of this, the Native American populations in the Andes Mountains explode. They're just huge. In fact, they're probably bigger than central Mexico, which had the other miracle food product of the Americas, which was corn. So the Inca population is just massive. And the Inca kings eventually began establishing an empire in the 1300s and 1400s, and they used the massive amount of food that they have, and they order their subjects to donate some of their year as work. And so the Inca kings create roads and bridges and walls, and by doing so, they quickly expand their empire because their army is well fed, they have a lot of people, which means big armies, and they can move those armies quickly. They've got everything they need to become a military successful empire. Unfortunately for the Inca, in the mid-1500s, the Spanish hear about them, and they decide that they're going to go do the same thing to the Inca that they did to the Aztecs. And Francisco Pizarro leads a band of Spanish conquistadors, and they kidnap the emperor of the Incas, demand a huge ransom of payment, and again, effectively take over the center of the Inca Empire and demand tribute from the Inca. Now, the Inca are more sophisticated from an empire perspective than the Aztecs. And so for a few years, they play along. They say, okay, we'll pay. But after about 10 years, they go, no, we don't want to pay. We want our nation back. Unfortunately for the Inca, by this point, there's too many Spanish. And they try and resist, they try and fight back, and the Spanish are just too numerous, and they fail and they lose. Now, again, from a cultural perspective, though, the Inca's population was huge. And in fact, it is so big that even with disease, the Inca population does not disappear. In fact, there are a number of people in South America that are basically direct descendants of the Inca. They are ethnically Inca. Same genetics, same look. They're Inca people. But they also intermarry with the Spanish. And so you have a unique Inca Spanish culture that develops along the west coast. And by the way, that culture primarily develops because the Spanish were interested in silver. What they found is that the Inca Empire had access to almost unlimited amounts of silver. In fact, the Spanish mined so much silver out of South America that they crashed the European and Chinese economies. They mined so much silver out, sent it back to Europe, they sent it to China by way of the Philippines, and there was so much silver in circulation that silver actually fell in value. It used to be that gold and silver were similar in value. A gold coin and a silver coin were similar in value. And the Spanish mined so much silver that it was so much more common that it wasn't valuable anymore. Reduced in value. And that actually crashed their economy. So Spain actually ruined their own economy by being greedy in the New World. That's irony for you. All right, I know this video is very long at this point. Let's talk about the last section of South America, and that is the southeast section. And this is southern Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, that section. That section of South America is kind of an enigma because it is actually probably the most hospitable for Europeans or for people in general. It's very hospitable. It's got lots of nice open land. It's got a decent climate. It's got lots of water. Why weren't there Native Americans there? Why weren't there Native American empires there? Well, the main reason is because the natives in that area did not have agricultural resources. They didn't have a plant product like potatoes or corn. They didn't have domesticated animals. In fact, really no one in the New World had domestic animals. The largest domestic animals in the New World were alpacas, right? And they're not that big. They're not great meat animals. They're fine for their wool, but they're not great eating animals. So the area of southern Brazil, Argentina, is really almost uninhabited. There's a few native groups, but it really doesn't have many. And so the Europeans finally arrived there in the late 1500s, early 1600s, and they began colonizing the area. And effectively what they do is they bring European culture in, and it's very pure. They don't have a lot of interaction with Africans there. The slave economies don't really come down that far. There's some slaves, not a lot. There's no natives. And so what you have is a pure European society. And I don't say pure meaning that it's better. I'm just saying from a perspective of cultural blending, there is no cultural blending. It's just a European society. And that's true even to this day. And if you look at the later history of South America, Brazil has a close relationship with Portugal, and Argentina has a close relationship with Spain, and that even leads Argentina to favor Germany during World War II because Spain was a fascist power, and Argentina had connections with Spain and hence Germany. So there's a very European culture, and really historically, those southern nations of South America have been the most developed technologically, economically, because again, it's really just European transplants. Now that's changed in the last few decades. Things have changed, but that's an entirely separate culture. So we have talked about 5 separate sections of the Spanish New World, and all 5 of them are radically different. The Caribbean, we have African and European mixing. In Mexico and Central America, we have Spanish and native indigenous populations mixing. In the northern part of South America, we have African and natives mixing. In the west side of South America, we have the Inca and the Spanish mixing. And really, the Inca have such a large population that some of the Inca don't even mix. And then we have the southeastern part of South America, where we have primarily European development. Of course, there's intermarriage with other parts of South America over time. So today, yes, you probably wouldn't be able to tell that Argentinians and southern Brazilians are entirely European. But still, the original colonists didn't intermix. So you have completely different cultures, completely different zones all throughout South America, all because of this different process that occurred down there. Hopefully that's been interesting to you. I would encourage you this week, go find a documentary about South America or Central America. Watch it, maybe a historical one if you can find one. They're sometimes hard to find in English. If you speak Spanish, obviously it gets a lot easier. But look up a documentary of the area, explore it, okay? Especially someplace like Patagonia or the Pantanal in Brazil. Pick an area that interests you and watch a documentary. It's not homework, it's just a suggestion, but get to know South America as we dig into it more in the next coming weeks. All right, guys, have a great rest of your week, and I'll see you next time.